I think like a lot of things we do to create a better life for everyone on this planet is just not going to happen just by our scientific understanding of the world. I think there's just a huge social dimension that's mostly the bottleneck.
This is the Livable Future podcast. I'm co-creator Katie Barker, and in today's episode, I sit down with PhD student Siwook Hwang to talk about a common narrative that we have in agricultural research and why that narrative might need to be challenged. I would like to begin this episode by acknowledging that we are creating this podcast on lands that were the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples. We would like to honor these people and their contributions to this region. First, would you begin by telling us your scientist origin story?
Well, I think it, for me, kind of all started while I was studying abroad in Thailand. I was on this program during college that was like a sustainability themed and sustainability oriented. And as part of that, we had like a few field courses where we went around and sort of, backpacked around or like kayaked around and kind of learned from sort of the local communities. And, did our own interview in Thai and everything, which was super cool. But yeah, before that, I wasn't really interested in soils, which is what I study now. But yeah, one day we were doing this soils activity in this village. The goal was to kind of dig a handful of soil from different kind of farming systems and compare them. And I was like super bored. And we went to like the annual corn farm and digged up the soil, and it was like super degraded, like super dry. And at the end of the day, that day we went into this agroforest that someone had started like 10 years ago. And then there we dug up like a handful of soil, and then like something about that, and like we got very kind of rich, dark soil that just felt different and felt healthy. And all of us were just kind of like, our group was just like standing around in awe. And I think it's kind of that moment that I was like, oh shit, soil can be really cool. And yeah, and after that I've kind of gotten interested in kind of intersection of agriculture and soil, and that's what brought me here.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, there's really nothing like seeing the difference, is there? So you recently wrote about the dangers of this thing that you called the scarcity axiom. First of all, what exactly is that? What do you mean by that?
Well, let's start with scarcity narrative, which is what I see a lot in agriculture, at least, is this structure where we try to kind of introduce our science and kind of relate our science to a broader audience by saying, population is growing. We have to keep up our like food production to kind of continue to feed the world. And here is why my research can support like continued food production. And, that depends on food being scarce. And when we say that over and over, and that, that when that becomes sort of unquestioned statement, that's when I think it becomes like a scarcity axiom, when people don't question it because we say it so much, and that's where our argument begins. We don't have to back that up with much. And yeah, because we say so much, it becomes ingrained in the public's eyes. And when that happens, we tend to use it more because, public knows that we are running out of food. Let me just say this as a kind of point of departure when I talk to the public.
And that's a really old narrative that's been going on. Like Soylent Green is about that. All of this, it's been going on since right before the Green Revolution, right?
I mean, Malthus was writing about it in England way back when. So yeah, it's a really, really, really old notion.
And you think that right now the narrative continues to be focused on let's keep upgrading our production?
It kind of depends, I think. I think there's a huge sort of environmental effect side that's introduced to the conversation, talking about all these downsides of the way we do agriculture now. But I think still, even then, the conversation is about we still need to produce a certain amount of food to feed the world. How do we do that? How do we create that much food without, polluting the water, for example? So I think the conversation is still very much focused around, how do we kind of take our way through this? Or in a more like systems perspective, how do we create more sustainable systems to create more food then? I think that's kind of the implied assumptions in many of the research going on right now.
So what is the danger with this axiom?
I think it can be summed up as like when we talk about scarcity axiom and stop kind of questioning it, we very much kind of simplify what scarcity is in the modern world and how it comes to be, because scarcity as it's experienced now, it's mostly artificially generated. It's about it, it has a huge kind of social and economic origins more than production side of things. So when we start talking about scarcity as this kind of immovable fact, we start to erase those things. And, it's scarcity is generated to serve some kind of purpose. And when we try to make that scarcity as just a fact of, human civilization, then we also start to ignore why scarcity is generated and how it's enforced. So I think that's the biggest danger.
So we ignore how we got there and we just say, oh, everything is scarce, like natural resources are scarce.
Right. For example, I think of most scarcity in terms of food just because it's most visceral to me. And also because I'm in agricultural stuff. And, food shortages is so funny to me because it is so apparent that we do generate and produce enough food to feed everyone in this country and around the world. But people are still going hungry and people still experience famines. So, I think when we kind of lean on scarcity axiom, the narrative becomes, oh, of course, we experience scarcity and the human population is always growing and food can follow up. Then we kind of start to ignore, well, we do have enough food now, but why are some people still going hungry?
Right. It's like we're trying to solve the wrong problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Like the common number that goes around, especially in the US, is that 40% of all food that are, created go to waste. And I'm sure some of it is not necessarily salvageable. In such a huge system, there's going to be some laws. But then it can't be all 40%. Some of it, is being wasted due to the huge swath of people who cannot pay for food. And we have an economic system where it makes more sense to bar certain people from accessing food that instead going to the landfills.
Yeah, nothing is 100% efficient, right, but you would hope for a higher number than 60% efficiency in any system. So that is definitely, that's the number that always gets me too. So this sort of aspect of access to resources reminds me also of another thing that you wrote about, which is the population crisis. And this one is really important to me also because I feel like I hear this a lot in academia and in other environmentally conscious groups where people start talking about population and the population crisis, and that population is just skyrocketing and we need to limit our growth. But I kind of hate this argument because I think ultimately it also becomes a question of who has the right to have babies. And it can quickly get into racist colonial ideas and quickly jump to the conclusions of, well, we're productive members of society and you aren't. And nobody seems to stop and think about how people don't use up the same number of resources everywhere. The privileged members of society have a much larger impact.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, when we have scarcity axiom, that's population is growing, we got to keep up food production. Then one part of that argument is that population is growing and that's a problem. I think that when people say population is growing, they are implicitly kind of saying, there's a quotation around population. They're talking about all these poor people, all these kind of people from global south are, just really, the population is increasing. And us from the quote unquote civilized society where we have little more stable population growth, have to, look at that as a crisis. And, from that alone, you kind of build up this narrative where these people who have kind of least amount of access to resources become this villain, right? And, the people who are in quote unquote first world developed countries become sort of the saviors, which is, you have to sort of think about, I think that population growth in itself is not something that you can be specifically worried about without getting down some really morally treacherous road. But also in that argument and villainization of different population of people, I think you have to also consider sort of the historical and colonial aspect of what has happened to those quote unquote third world countries.
Yeah, it's sort of, we need almost the opposite approach where right now we're considering scarcity as just a fact of life and nothing that needs to be addressed systemically. But then we're considering population growth as a crisis, a problem that we need to fix instead of just a fact of life.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, I don't know much about population dynamics to be able to speak on that specifically. But yeah, I would just say that I have seen, even from like very, highly regarded funding agencies that studies agricultural systems, they're like, oh, this population is increasing and we're going to hit this like whatever billions of people by 20, I don't know, 50 or whatever. And then like background slide image is just like a busy street in China for some reason, right? And that's, like, I think that is very thinly veiled.
Right? Why that city?
Yeah, it's like, why are you doing that? Yeah, exactly.
When you could just as easily show London or Denver.
Yeah, we're just show the graph or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or LA. I don't know. So yeah, I think that just like a lot of people do that and without even thinking about it, and like without kind of thinking about what that kind of does to our mind implicitly, which is kind of troublesome, in a more, I don't know, in broader context. People need to be aware of how they use imageries.
Yeah, for sure. You made the really good point that scientists are actually also storytellers. We're in charge of translating raw data into something that we can understand, which means that we also have the responsibility of storytellers of what story are we telling?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most exciting part that I figured out while I was like got into academia. I was like, oh, I always wanted to be an author, right? I wanted to be a writer growing up. And then I was like, oh, this is like writing, but I just have to do there's just a lot of labor overhead before I can actually get to writing. That's kind of the only difference.
Not to mention you have to back up every single sentence with sources. And yeah. Yeah, I'm the same. I was a writer actually before. Yeah. Not of books, but that was a goal.
Yeah. Here we are.
So how do you think we could shift? We need to start with why does what we do matter? And we need to communicate that to the public and say, hey, we're not just, wasting your taxpayer dollars and whatnot, playing around in a lab. We're actually doing something that's important. Yeah. How do we do that?
Oh, God. Yeah.
I know, big question.
Yeah, I know. When I first wrote it, there was like a huge kind of positive reaction from the people. And one of the questions was like, like you pointed out this problem that, a lot of people, it seemed to resonate with a lot of people, but then how do we move forward? Excuse me. Then, yeah, and I think that's obviously a harder question to answer. I think it's easier for me to point out a problem than it's to like figure out how to solve it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And, it's not that anyone's expecting me to solve a problem single-handed, but I've been thinking a lot. So that's to say, I've been thinking a lot about it ever since I wrote that essay. And I think there are sort of multi-tiered approach in terms of how radical of a change we are willing to give to how we generate knowledge and how academia functions. Because I think that the most minor change you can make is to be like, when we start talking about our science, we can talk about how, hunger is mostly caused by non-production issues, but still we use a whole lot of energy and resources, and there's a lot of different things that go wrong in generating the food that we do make. And that kind of food produced, like the harm done per unit of food, I think is still a valid argument to make, right? Because even if we were to descale our food production system to just meet the need of the population, I think the question still remains, can we do that sustainably and without kind of ruining the whole ecology of the planet. And I think that's still a fascinating question, and I think we can communicate that pretty well. And I think that is like one of the alternate ways we can talk about our science. And I think if we wanted to be more kind of radical, I think we have to actively presuppose a post-scarcity world and post-capitalist world in our science, where if we were living in a society, like decades from now or like centuries from now, where every like ounce of food we produce and every ounce of resources we have are equal, justly distributed, then what kind of problem are we going to have if we were to keep up this method of resource extraction? And how do we solve that within that context where we are actively preparing for a better world to come rather than trying to mitigate kind of the unjust systems that we have right now and kind of prolong its life, I guess.
So what would you say to non-scientists or people who don't identify as scientists that may be listening to this?
I think people have to be cognizant of sort of the power dynamics that are embedded within any conversations about resource, right? Or like the use of natural land in terms of like, growing food and stuff like that. When you say there is a problem, right? How does that problem come to be, and how, like, what other aspects are there to the problems that they're describing other than the solution that they're suggesting? I think it's something that you have to kind of look out for, when you think about, there's like a freshwater shortage, and here is, let's say there's a paper about, here is some technology that can filter wastewater in this really cheap way, and here's our findings about it. You have to ask, why are they out of fresh water, and like who actually has access to fresh water then and who doesn't, and do anyone benefit from some people not having fresh water, or just like, do people use more fresh water? Some people use more fresh water than others. And I think that kind of question has to be asked also by the scientists, but also by the people who consume kind of what scientists are having to say.
So kind of looking past just like, okay, cool solution to a problem, but also what was the cause of that problem to begin with?
Right. And I think you can also think about in a kind of reverse way, where you're like, okay, so let's say we apply this solution. Will that problem be fixed? Right. And I think most scientists will just play it safe and say no, because I think people are aware that what they're doing isn't a silver bullet. But often we are pressured to present it like it is a silver bullet, just because that's kind of how we up our research game and get attention and get funding. But, it is scientists' job to notice that it is not a silver bullet and communicate that, and its audience can encourage that behavior by kind of questioning that further.
What trends do you see that give you hope?
I think I'd see most hopeful things in more personal and kind of localized context. I think there's a lot of good labor organizing happening and mutual aid organizing happening around the world, which is, I think, kind of the foundations upon like the more like a bigger systemic changes are, built. So yeah, I'll say that stuff kind of gives me hope.
That was episode 10 of the Livable Future podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope that you'll check out some further reading on our website. Thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.